I'm also going to go ahead and drop our plugs in. I'm going to gap them to 40 thousandths just to keep any junk from falling down into there so we don't have to cover the engine anymore. I like to throw just a dab of amp DCs right behind the ground strap just to keep it from binding in the head. Go ahead and put the other three in. Alright, now we can start getting all of our bracketry back on. We can start with the AC compressor bracket. The bolt on the front actually goes into the oil pump, if you remember that. And we can just get these, tight. They're pretty big bolts, so you don't want to reef on them, but don't want them coming out. The front bolt is a little smaller. Front bolt's a little smaller, it's a 12, while the other ones are 14s. It doesn't need as much torque. There we go. Alright, next thing on this side is we have the power steering bracket. If you have power steering. Same deal here with the bolt torque. Not a critical place. These are 14mm headed bolts. Alright, so the tensioner bracket for the alternator goes onto this ear of the water pump. Alright, so for our alternator, we'll take out this bolt here. And that ear goes through like that. Then we've got a pivot bolt that goes from the back of the block here through the block to the other ear on the alternator. So we'll leave both pivot bolts slightly loose and go ahead and tighten up the bracket bolt now. You see there is our travel, and I think we're actually good now to go ahead and put on our alternator belt. Alright, so here's our oil cooler. We're going to want to lube up the seal a little bit with some oil. And this nut is 29mm or 1.125". They interchange. Then you can torque the nut to 22 to 28 foot-pounds. While we're here, we might as well put our new oil filter on. Lube up our seal. I'm using a Bosch oil filter because I got a good deal on it on Rock Auto. Alright, now we got the water outlet on the rear of the head. So go ahead and put our new gasket on there. Torque spec on this is 14 to 18 foot-pounds, like the rest of these 12mm headed bolts. Alright, now I believe we're ready to go ahead and put our intake manifold back on. So my gasket kit came with two different manifold gaskets. Obviously only one fits. I believe the BP4W, which is what this is, has a higher port angle that increases the flow into the valves. That way the air charge doesn't have to make a turn, as much of a turn. So this is probably for the earlier motors. We don't need it. As always, you're going to want to make sure the sealing surface on the intake is clean. Obviously on our head we're clean. It was bead blasted. Just send her home. Then we've got, I believe, 9 of these nuts. Just drop them, that works. Just use a nice long extension to fish these in. Now on the topic of intakes, this is a 99 with the BP4W, like I've said probably a million times now. This intake's different than the other earlier intakes. It's got, I think it's VCIS, there's little butterfly flaps in here that open up and change the intake volume at a certain RPM. And there's a lot of science that goes into intake systems, because the amount of volume and all the pressure pulses add up, and if you have a very specific design of length of intake runners and intake volume, you actually get a little bit of force feeding from the intake pulses, and obviously you get a little bit more power and efficient burn from that. So that's kind of why they have that in there. These 12mm headed bolts get torqued to 14 to 18 foot-pounds. We're going to kind of work from the center out. They're already snugged up, so let's just Just the final torque. Do it in a couple stages. Alright, so I'm a dummy. I forgot the fuel rail does not fit between the intake and the head. So we gotta take that back off, and then we can put our fuel rail on. So ideally you'd be replacing these seals on the injectors. My kit unfortunately did not come with any seals, so we're gonna reuse them. Not a gigantic deal, especially since this isn't direct injection and they still look okay. So kind of funky seals compared to what I've seen before. They're like a hard plastic, but they work, I guess. So we've got those little plastic spacers that go down in the head. We've got 3 of these bolts. Then these 12mm headed bolts get torqued to 14 to 18 foot-pounds. You can also go ahead and put the fuel wiring harness back in place. Should just snap back in. Alright, now we can go ahead and put our intake back on, which I will do right now. Alright, so with the intake back on, there's a couple things we can take care of now. So we do have this bolt that goes from the fuel rail to the intake, along with this ground strap, which I believe goes like that. Then our fuel line, which is different, I believe, on the 99 to 2000 versus the earlier motors. I think the earlier motors have a return line also. This one doesn't, so we just got to clip that wire harness clip up there. We do still need to hook up the coolant lines for the oil cooler. And then we also have a support bracket that goes from here down to the block. So this rear coolant line for the oil cooler goes around the block over to this coolant nipple here. Everything kind of has a memory of where it wants to go. So honestly, this stage is kind of just making sure every connector has a home, every coolant connection has a home, and usually the old stuff will kind of fit to where it wants to go, so it makes it nice and easy. Then here in the front we got a couple connections to make. So this wire harness connection, it looks like we need to take the front timing cover bolts back out, and it connects using those. Not wire harness cover, timing cover. Then we have this coolant line that comes across and goes into the nipple coming off the water outlet. We can also secure our coils. It's held down with 3 bolts, these 2 in the valve cover and 1 down here. We can also plug in our water temp sensor. Here's the lower bolt, it's got a washer on it. You can also plug in our plug wires. Also, go ahead and reconnect the PCV valve. I gotta get a new one. You can see it got all brittle like they do and cracked. Looks like the hose also got mangled. This engine was partially torn down before I actually bought the car, so I think this was all like this before, unfortunately, so I don't know if I have that hose anymore. We also have our lifting eyes to put back on. This angled one goes back here. You want to use a torque wrench on this, I believe it's 28 to 38 foot-pounds. Threads are feeling weird. No? Maybe it was bending the bracket and that's what I was feeling. There we go. And this lifting eye goes over here. Alright, we should be able to get our exhaust manifold on now. So there's our gasket. Now our manifold's got this EGR tube coming off, so we'll have to snake that around. So over here on the intake manifold, we've got 2 of these little 10mm nuts and a steel gasket that we need to replace, and then we can seat that on there and get the manifold seated down. And you can see there's actually a clamp that's supposed to clamp onto the rear water outlet. It's broken on ours, so I'm just going to take it off. I think we'll be okay. Take it off to prevent any rattles. We'll leave this kind of loose until we get the manifold bolted down. So we've also got 9 exhaust nuts. I like to use a little bit of never seize or anti-seize on the studs just to help take the nuts out if we ever need to. And then our heater hose outlet right here shares that stud. with the exhaust manifold. Then all these nuts get torqued to 29 to 33 foot-pounds. We'll work out from the center. Looks like our heat shield's a little mangled here. There's a few bolts missing for the heat shield. I think that was taken out by the previous owner, a master mechanic I might add. Then we don't want to forget to snug down our EGR tube nuts. Alright, so last couple things, we have our intake to engine block support. It's got these two long bolts that go in. Then the lower bolt is the same style, a little shorter. This isn't actually the OEM bolt. I don't know where it is. It was missing already. But luckily I had something that'll work laying around in the stash. And now for our motor mounts. So the motor mounts only fit on one way. And they're held on by 3 of these bolts. Long one goes down here apparently. Now the rubber on ours looks good, so I'm reusing it, but if yours is all cracked up or it's like oil contaminated and all soft, then it's a good idea to replace it. Otherwise it's going to be kind of jumping around in place. Both of our rubbers look like this. If you've got cracks running around horizontally, then you know it's probably time to replace it. You can see we're starting to get a little cracking here, but it should be fine for now. Then these get torqued to 27 to 39 foot-pounds. Other side's the same story, except all of the bolts are the same length. They're all the shorter bolts, versus this side, which has one longer bolt. Alright, I think we've just about got our engine all dressed up now. Hopefully it's not playing pretend, I guess we're going to find out. But now it's time to get it off the stand, and we're going to put our clutch and flywheel on, and then we can mate this thing to the transmission. Alright, so it's up off the stand. I went ahead and put our missing freeze plug or cork plug back in. Hopefully it doesn't leak on us. It was a little looser than the other ones, but I guess we'll see. So we're going to put our separator plate on first. I also cleaned all the surfaces of paint from when we were painting the black. Looks like there might be a lip or something on that dowel we got to take care of. There we go. We've got this little 10mm headed bolt that helps hold it on. Now we're ready for a flywheel. Just want to clean up the surface, the face of the rear of the crank. Here's our old flywheel. You can see it's pretty heat soaked. The clutch was probably slipping a little bit, and there's a lot of heat marks on here. You can turn them. It's kind of a toss-up on whether it's worth it, because the base metal has obviously been subjected to that heat, so you can turn it away and make it flat again. I don't know how that would compare to a new flywheel exactly. I guess it depends on how messed up the surface is for the clutch. I went ahead and got a new flywheel just because it's really not much more than getting a used flywheel resurfaced. I couldn't actually find a stock flywheel, so this is like 7 pounds lighter, I think, or a little less than that than the stock one. I think the stock's like around 19 pounds. This is around 14 pounds, or 12 pounds, I think. But it'll make it a little more rev happy. It's still streetable. We have another one that had a pretty light flywheel on it, and it wasn't bad to drive, so I'm hoping this will do good for us. So we just want to make sure the back side of the flywheel is good to go. Got a couple bolts and thread it in to help us hold it. So the holes on the crank flange go all the way into the oil pan, so you do need to put some kind of sealant on here. I'm going to use Loctite. It should seal this up just fine, and also make sure the bolts don't come unthreaded. So now we need to lock the crank so that we can tighten the bolts, otherwise they're just going to turn. So we can just thread in a bell housing bolt here, and then use a big screwdriver or pry bar or whatever to wedge the teeth of the flex plate or flywheel while we tighten the bolts. And the final torque on these is going to be 71 to 75 foot-pounds. A little bit of a dance to Hold everything still while you torque. I think we've got them all. We just gotta go back through and check one more time. Alright, there's our flywheel. For our clutch, I'm just using a stock replacement exit kit. Comes with everything you need other than the flywheel, obviously. So we need to put our new pilot bearing in. Feels good. Doesn't matter which way it goes in. I'm gonna use a bearing driver. Just gotta set this in place. Make sure it can fit between the bolts, which it can't. Yeah, sound change, we're flush with the face of the flywheel. So we know we're all the way home. Alright, so next we need to make sure the face of the flywheel is completely free of oil. We also need to make sure the clutch cover is completely cleaned off of any oil. So now we need to put our clutch cover and disc on. So the clutch disc, you see it says TM side, transmission side. That means we want this pointing out. It's gonna go like that. And it looks like we got a couple alignment dowels. Now we can slide in our alignment tool. A little tight going on the dowels. Okay, I think we'll try to pull it on even with the bolts. So the flex plate or flywheel came with new bolts for us. Go ahead and use those. I am using Loctite just because these are spinning fast. Don't want them coming loose. So as we're running them down, we want to make sure the clutch disc stays in the center, because as we're tightening it down, it's clamping the clutch disc. Should be able to pull it out very easy, which we can. That means we should be able to get it into the transmission pretty easy. Then we'll hold the flywheel again with a screwdriver, and these get torqued to 14 to 19 foot-pounds. Looks like we don't even really need to hold it. Just to make sure we don't miss one. Go ahead and mark them with paint. There we go, now we can turn our attention to the transmission. Alright, so before we shove our transmission into our engine, we got to replace the clutch release bearing. Go ahead and pull the old one off. Yeah, that one's really bad. So you can see the release fork has these little nubs. We're going to clean them off and put some new grease on it. And the bearing just sits around that. We also are going to lube up the splines of the transmission just to make sure it goes in there smooth, just a little bit. So yeah, let's do it. We'll lube up the collar too. See, our clutch arm also just pulls out. Go ahead and clean it up some and lube up the little ball that it pivots on. There we go. Now the fun part, hernia time. Alright, so the bell housing bolt locations are pretty self-explanatory. Most of them are the same size. The only ones that are different is this one has the longer bolt and a nut. And then over here on the exhaust bracket, the longest one goes up top. All the other ones are the same size, I believe, and they're all going to get torqued to, I think it's 49 to 65 foot-pounds, so we'll just shoot for the center there, get torquing away. I'm going to go ahead and also put the starter in now. You could put it in the car, but we got easy access right now. I mean, we're going to have to connect the wire harness connections anyways, but whatever. I believe this lower one is what gets the nut. Okay, it should be squared away there. Alright, couple last things before we set it in the car. We got to make sure these plates are on over the motor mounts. Also, I forgot, we got to put the heat shield on still. Then we can also go ahead and put our dipstick down in there. New O-ring, of course. Then put this ground strap. With that, I think we're ready to go ahead and drop it in the car. I'm going to blitz through the process and not go step by step. If you do want a step-by-step install, we do have another video. We were swapping a motor on our 921, so check that out if you want. Alright, so I believe everything is hooked up. Now we can go ahead and do our fluids. I already filled up the transmission and differential. I did swap out the differential for a Torsen because I found one for a really good deal at the junkyard, 150 bucks. Can't beat that. So those are filled up. We just got to put coolant and oil in it. Oh, I forgot to put the coolant temp sender in way back there on the back of the head by the water outlet on the rear of the head. So have to snake that in there, and then hopefully we are good to go. Alright, I'm going to let the rear of the car down so that the front's at the top and let all the air out. Just need 4 quarts of 1030. That should just about do it. We don't have any active leaks. Kind of hard to tell because with the coolant fiasco, but top off our expansion tank. Try to get that to go down a little bit. Put the cap on. Alright, I'm going to throw a battery in it, and then I think we're just about ready to fire it up. Alright, so I think everything's buttoned up. I put some new gas in it. Got all the fluids filled up, so fire up and see what happens. Okay, here's the fuel pump. Let's see. Alright, so we do not have any fuel pump running, so chase that. Check the fuse and then go from there. Might have had a failed pump. Oh. That could be part of it. Alright, so our main fuse was blown in the fuse box. I don't know if that was before me or not. Hopefully it was. It's held on with 2 bolts, which I didn't realize. That's why this is cracked, even though it's a new one. Pulled off our parts car. I thought it was just the same style as these other large ones, but no, there's actually spades that bolt on either side. So let's see if it blows again. Alright, so our main fuse didn't blow, but we're still not getting any fuel pressure. So I went ahead and took the access cover off of the back here. We're going to check for voltage at the fuel pump wires. I believe it's red and a black stripe, and that black one that we need to test across. Alright, I've got the test light on that one wire. Got to do a little bit of juggling, so we'll see if it makes good contact. But alright, so I've got this little voltage display on the connector there. I can't find my real multimeter, so got that little dinky thing. It works. So now if we go over to the diagnostic port, I've got the jumper grounded, and this pin actuates the fuel pump relay, which hopefully you can hear is clicking. And if we look over here, I don't know why it's saying 00, but we're getting voltage. Let's turn it on. It might have crappy contact in there. Yeah, there we go. Okay. And if we unjumper it, turns off obviously. But I may have just been wrong about the behavior of this thing. I don't think it primes the fuel pump, because if we turn the key on, or off and then on, no voltage. But if we crank, you can see it does get voltage. And also if I plug the fuel pump back in and jumper it, it doesn't run. So we got a bad fuel pump. So I'll go steal one out of our parts car to put into this thing, and then hopefully we'll be golden. Okay, I think it's safe to say with all this rust, this thing's been sitting quite a while. No wonder the pump's bad. So I'll go yank it out of our parts car and swap her over real quick. Alright, so pump swapped. Still kind of gross, but should work for us. I had to do a little bit of a creative modification to get the pump connector to fit. We We're just going to use this to test. We can swap it out later. This is just to get it started and going down the road for now. So I'm going to go pop this back in and we'll see if she starts up. Alright, keys on. Let's jumper this and see what happens. I hear movement. Might just be a really quiet fuel pump. Yep, it's running. Interesting, okay. So yeah, that blown main fuse. I don't even think the fuel pump runs off that. Kind of interesting. A little bit of a red herring. But yeah, I think we're getting fuel pressure now. Bet you it'll fire right up now. Alright, so before we start this up, because I think it'll start up this time, hopefully. Quick thing about braking. Engine braking is something that you ask 10 different guys what to do and you're going to get 15 different answers. My opinion, brake the car in like you're going to drive it. If you're just doing a daily driver on like, you know, a 90 Civic or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Now if it's a flat tappet engine like an old American block, then there's a specific procedure that the cam manufacturer specifies. You gotta hold it at 2500 RPM or whatever for 30 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever it is to make sure that the cam gets splash lubed enough while the lifters are breaking in. We don't have to worry about that with this. The only thing that breaks in are the piston rings to the cylinder bore. This, I want it to be as much as... this, I want to get as much out of it as we can, so we're going to thrash on it a little bit. As soon as we get it started up, we're going to get it warmed up and take it out on the road and do some hard pulls in third, fourth gear, somewhere around there, almost a red line, and then let it coast down under heavy vacuum. Because piston rings, they seal due to the gas pressure, and if you're just kind of moseying down the road, there's not a whole lot of gas pressure pushing the rings out against the wall. When you're at really high load, there's a lot of cylinder pressure, and that pushes the rings out against the cylinder wall and makes sure they wear concentric to the bore. So we're going to do some heavy pulls once we get this out on the road, and hopefully that'll give us a good ring seat. But first, we're going to see if it's going to fire up. Looking good. Alright, fired up. We got a check engine light. Probably missed plugging something in, so I'm going to read the code real quick and we'll see what we missed. Alright, so it's throwing a code for the ECT, engine coolant temperature sensor, which I just didn't have the plug seated all the way, and the NOx sensor, which makes sense because I didn't put it in. I don't know why it was running so rough. It didn't throw any codes for that. Usually if it's running that rough, it's like the MAF isn't plugged in or the TPS isn't plugged in, stuff like that. Didn't throw any codes for that, so we'll put the NOx sensor in, which shouldn't really affect how it's running, and then we'll see how it runs from there. Maybe it just needs a second to settle in. This is going to be a little bit annoying to get to. It sits right above the oil filter under the intake manifold. Would have been way easier out of the car, but whatever. It's the way it goes. Alright, NOx sensor's back in. The connector was just hanging out right here. Just missed it. It happens. Now I think we can start it back up. Hopefully it'll clear out a little bit. It was running kind of rough initially. And once it clears out, we'll drive around, warm it up, and do that break-in procedure. Alright, so it seemed to clear up. We're going to let it sit here for a second so we can check for leaks. As soon as we make sure nothing's, grossly leaking, then we can take it out, start rolling around, get it up to temp, and break it in. Alright, well, maiden voyage, here we go. Alright, so we're going to do some heavy pulls in third gear from like 2200 all the way up, full throttle right now. Putting it under heavy load, we're going to bring it up to 5,000. Snap off, let it coast back down. This is just to seat the rings in. Luckily we're in Mexico, so we don't really have to care about breaking any laws. Also, we're in a Miata, so kind of hard to break those laws that are not in the place that we are right now. The reverse synchros are not happy. Definitely gonna let her slide. Alright, so we did a few of those heavy pulls, heavy decelerations, and now the rings are seated in. That's Flying Miata's braking procedure, and I figure they've built a lot more 1/8s than I have, so we'll go off their recommendations. Now they recommend drive it nice and easy for the next 300 or so miles, so we'll probably do that.